titled An Exposition of Ashura. We have been joined with us today, our very own Sheikh Anwar Jaffer. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. It's great to have you back.
Alaikum salam, Muhammad. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm keeping great. How are you keeping?
Alhamdulillah. Nice to be back. Ahsan.
Alhamdulillah. So before we kind of begin the session today, I think it'd be quite useful if we are able to provide a quick 1 or 2 lines on the summary on what we had covered last week. So just as a reminder to our viewers, the topic of discussion that we started discussing last week was titled the causes and motivations of Imam Husayn alayhi salam. And we discussed how the movement against Imam Husayn alayhi salam tried to water down his uprising, his revolution, and tried to give it different words of how it was more of a political stunt and that Imam Husayn alayhi salam wanted the caliphate. And it was nothing more than just a glorified way of kind of getting martyrdom, but rather of his real motivations, which was, of course, to bring reform to the nation of his grandfather and to revive the teachings of his father. Sheikh, is there anything that you would like to add to this?
So based on أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. So based on the discussion that you mentioned last week, we discussed the different opinions given to us by modern day thinkers as to why Imam Husayn alayhi salam stood against Yazid ibn Muawiyah, against the Banu Umayyah in general. And we explored the different reasons, we explored the different motives behind his uprising, and we discussed why some of them are not as genuine as it may seem. It may seem very eloquent, it may seem very as attractive, for example, motives, but in general, when you go back to his words, when you go back to his sermons, when you go back to his motives, you realize that they were not in line with his intentions. And we concluded, obviously, last week's session that the Imam alayhi salam simply wanted to reform his grandfather's ummah. And by doing so, he had to give his life, he had to sacrifice his life. And he knew that from the very beginning. He knew that he will need to give his life, his blood, and the blood of his family members to try and uphold the values of Islam according to the vision of his grandfather, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. So now today's discussion, I want to go into a bit more detail looking at the consequences of Karbala, looking at the aftermath, the effects of what happened afterwards. If you were to summarize the effects and try and summarize the consequences of Karbala, it's one word, isn't it? It's one sentence, that the Banu Umayyah collapsed. And within 2 generations, or 2 or 3 generations, you find that the Banu Umayyad, the whole dynasty of the Umayyads, began to fall apart. And obviously, the movement of Imam Husayn alayhi salam acted as an archetype for all future movements and uprising against tyrannical governments, against despotic rulers and dictators. Last night was the Shahadat Eve of Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. Historically, the Imam alayhi salam lived through 10 Umayyad leaders, right? 10 Umayyad caliphs. That's not normal. That's very, very shocking. That's abnormal, isn't it? Because in those days, you didn't have a democracy leadership where the people get together, they vote for a leader for 3-4 years, tenure of 3 to 4 years, and then they move on to a new leader. No, a leader was someone who would take position, who would take charge of his community, of his society, and lead it however he willed until the final days of his life. It would be normal to, live a life through 1 or 2 or maybe even perhaps 3 leaders. But to go through 10 in a handful of years showed how much discrepancy there was within that regime, how much changes they were going through, which obviously led ultimately to their demise. And then obviously the Banu Abbas who then took over the seat of the Caliph.
Brilliant. So given today's session, rightly so, the third one is titled The Effects and Consequences of Karbala. It appears that the discussions are obviously going to be the revolution that took place post Karbala. I guess to start this discussion off, what would be useful to understand is if you could start with a conversation and this discussion, if you could perhaps elaborate on some Quranic examples on revolutions that took place before the time of Imam Hussein alayhi salam.
So the Holy Quran, when it approaches this concept, is very interesting. You know, there are verses in the Quran which indicates that every generation, from the beginning of time until the very final end of days, until the day of judgment, there are communities, there are generations that will go through the same practices, the same principles. And one of them is oppression. The other one is people fighting against oppression, people fighting for truthfulness. And at the same time, in association with all of this, is how people will fight and uprise against a tyrannical government. Or, in better words, how despotic rulers will lose their power entirely. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes that promise in the Holy Quran. You know, there's a verse in the Quran, وَلَن تَجِدَ وَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا. You won't find a change in the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the practice of Allah. Meaning that every generation will go through certain things, certain problems. And having a despotic ruler, having a tyrannical ruler is one of them. And there's a verse in the Quran, قَدْ مَكَرَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ فَأَتَى اللَّهُ بُنْيَانَهُمْ مِنَ الْقَوَاعِدِ فَخَرَّ عَلَيْهِمُ السقف من فوقهم وأتاهم العذاب من حيث لا يشعرون. And he speaks about these leaders who, you know, they plan against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are cruel, they are tyrannical towards their communities. But before they complete their plans, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala demolishes their buildings and their foundations, or it demolishes their buildings from their foundations. So it's like the whole government, everything that they've worked so hard for, collapses. The roofs fall down one from above them. And of course, the punishment of Allah, the adab of Allah, come towards them from areas or from aspects that they had never seen or had even perceived. And what's interesting is that, you know, when the Prophet of Allah, when you look at his revolution, and his was a true revolution, a miracle in itself, where he was able to transform an entire community, an illiterate community, and create a community of um, people who are more inclined towards religion, people who were accepting of the religion of Islam. Not only that, but they acted as a platform or a catalyst that then created profound thinkers 6 or 7 generations later, you know, for 500 years. Um, uh, for 500 years, majority of the thinkers, majority of the scholars were coming in from Arabia. For 500 years, you know, the language of academia was Arabic. It wasn't English. Today, in this day and age, it's English. But in those days, it was Arabic. And it all started from the revolution of the Holy Prophet. You're talking about a community, you know, we spoke about this in the first week. You're talking about a community who was so jahil that, you know, the empires that surrounded Mecca didn't even bother, you know, overpowering it. Didn't even bother, for example, you know, expanding their power in these regions, because they knew it was not worth it, right? But then the Holy Prophet comes along and he revolutionizes the whole area. And so when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks to him about this, and he reminds him using this verse, he says to him, look, it acts as a reassurance that your revolution, the Quraysh of Mecca, they see you as a threat, they see you as an authority, a power. But this is not the first time that this has happened. Yes, they are despots, they are rulers in their time, and they are wicked, but we will dismantle their power. What's interesting is that when you go into the tafsir of this verse in particular, um, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, interestingly enough, he begins to talk about how the plotters are destroying the foundations of their own system, how they are destroying the foundations of their own buildings, which causes the ceiling to fall down on them. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's At-Tabrasi in his Majma' al-Bayan, when he speaks about Nimrud. And he says, you know, when you look at Nimrud, when Ibrahim stood against Nimrud physically built a tower up to the skies so that he could see the Lord of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And when he built this tower collapsed, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroyed this tower completely from the roots, from the foundations. And despite his strength, despite his power, Allah destroys it from the roots. Allah makes it clear to them that whatever you do, however tyrannical you are, you're deluded. In your own self-delusion, in your own self-sufficiency, you consider to be invincible. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows them how weak they are in reality. So that's something something that we need to be conscious about. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam has a profound hadith in this respect. He says, when you look at a leader, when you look at a tyrannical leader, this is a person who has safeguarded material treasures. This is a person who has worked so hard, so tirelessly. He has struggled and he has endeavored to try and maintain his power. But then in the end, he will be annihilated whilst he is still alive. This power will be taken away from him whilst he is still alive. And we see this in history. We see this so many times in history where dictators, once they were untouchable, but then towards the end of their lives, the power was slowly taken away from them. You look at the recent example of Saddam Hussein. You look at, for example, other tyrants in the world. At one point in time, they were powerful. They were untouchable. People used to, shake whilst they used to stand in their presence. But then towards the end of their lives, they were humiliated. They were humiliated in such a way, such a fashion, that no one is able to forget that, right?
Yeah, and there is no doubt that the revolution and the uprising of Imam Hussain alayhi salam has served as a catalyst to generations even after him, to serve as a source of inspiration to then uphold their own uprisings and revolutions. And going back to today's topic of the effects and consequences of the events of Karbala, Sheikh, what would you say are the effects of the uprising of Imam Hussain alayhi salam among the Umayyads? And I'm sure these are amongst a list of a lot more consequences that came out of them. And of course, the downfall of the Umayyads was one of the tremendous kind of fruits, or one of the fruits of Imam Hussein's uprising.
So yeah, this is a very interesting question. So when you look at the consequences of the Battle of Karbala, in essence, if you were to go into the core of the discussion, in essence, what happened was, as I mentioned, it basically demolished the whole movement of the Banu Umayyah. Their power collapsed, and it became weakened, and it was weakening year by year, until within a handful of years, in the time of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, the Banu Umayyah were completely overpowered. They were overwhelmed by the Banu Abbas. So when you approach what exactly caused the Banu Umayyah to diminish and their power to be stripped from them, you can subcategorize them into many different sections. So for example, the movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam allowed there to be a difference between state and religion. When Muawiyah became officially the caliph of the Muslim Ummah, one of the things he did was he tried to combine the two ideas, that the state is the religious authority, politics is part of Islam. In fact, it is Islam. So the leader, the caliph, has both positions as a political leader and a religious authority, which is obviously in par with our understanding of imamat. We believe that the imams have the authority of being religious leaders as well as political leaders. But anyone other than an imam, obviously, we have issues with that. We have grave issues with that. And history is very clear in this respect. So Imam Hussain alayhi salam, by giving his life, by acting how he did on the 10th of Muharram, was able to isolate state from religion. That was the first thing. Number two, when this massacre happened on the day of Ashura, what this happened was this had a ripple effect throughout the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, throughout the Muslim empire. And people were grief-stricken. People were in the state of remorse. And that is because they realized and they understood the crimes of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. They understood who Imam Hussain alayhi salam was. And this obviously was further aided by, the fundamental sermons of Bibi Zainab salamullahi alayhi, Imam Sajjad as well in Kufa, and their movement, even on the streets of Medina. People began to realize that this crime was not a normal crime. So because the people were now grief-stricken, this had a fundamental impact against their attitude towards the Banu Umayyah. The third was, through the events of Ashura, Imam Hussein alayhi salam was able to rekindle foresightedness, basira amongst the people. That's also a very, very interesting discussion. We'll get to that, inshallah, either this session or next session, inshallah. And then obviously you had the movements of Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, the movements of Bibi Zainab. What exactly did they do after the Battle of Karbala? What positions did they hold within the communities? How did they aid rallying the people against the Banu Umayyah? And then obviously, and more importantly, the aftermaths of what happened after after Karbala. And when Karbala takes place, all of a sudden people were motivated. People were empowered to lead uprisings against the Bani Umayyah. So we had many, many revolts, many revolutions taking place after Karbala until the time of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, which obviously weakened the Bani Umayyah from within much more than what you had anticipated before Karbala. So all of these combinations of different aspects and consequences ultimately led to the weakening and the demise of the Banu Umayyah.
So, among these consequences and the aftermath of Karbala, amongst foresightedness amongst the people, the movements of Imam Sajjad and Lady Zainab, and of course the downfall of Umayyah, you mentioned quite specifically as the first point of the Imam's vision to separate the state and the religion, something that Muawiyah hadn't done so, in fact had combined the two. So if we're able to kind of just focus a little bit more points on this, how was Imam able to achieve of kind of separating state from religion? And secondly, what does this mean in the grand scheme of things?
So when you examine the history of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, Muawiyah, when he signed the peace treaty with Imam Hassan alayhi salam, what happened was he disguised himself as a religious leader as well as a political leader. When you go into history, the books of history, you find that Muawiyah was very cunning. He was very smart, but not in a good way. And what he did was he established this idea of fabrication of ahadith. And so he employed a number of individuals. If you go easily, if you research this in the books of history, you find who these individuals were. Where they made it upon themselves, they were hired, they were promoted, they were paid. It was their job to fabricate ahadith. Hadith specifically raising the Banu Umayyah and certain members of the Umayyad family, and at the same time bringing down the Alawi, so bringing down the position of the Ahl al-Bayt alayhi salam. And we have so many examples of a hadith where certain individuals are raised, are made to be higher compared to the Ahl al-Bayt alayhi salam. And of course, the fadail of the Ahl al-Bayt have been watered down because of such and such personalities being raised to their levels. So Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan starts this, this propaganda of fabricating lies and ahadith to raise certain personalities up. One of the things that he begins officially was the la'na, was the cursing of Imam Ali alayhi salam from the pulpit. So on a Friday, for example, on the day of Jum'ah, you know how, for example, we go to the mosque and we engage in Salat al-Jum'ah. The Imam will begin with, for example, the praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, and then the praise on the prophets, and then the praise on the A'imma alayhim salam. In those times, they would begin with the praise of God. They would begin with the praise of the Holy Prophet. They would continue with the praise of the Khulafa, and then the families of the Khulafa, specifically referring to the Banu Umayyah, and then the advisors of the Khulafa, and then the soldiers of the Khulafa, and those who show adamant support, those who show unconditional support to the political power. And then they would end with the curse of Imam Ali alayhi salam. And this happened week after week after week. Whenever there was a lecture, for example, they would, somehow throw this information there to the people. Now, when you have a child who is raised in that environment, that child begins to think that this is what religion is, this is what Islam is, that there has to be certain level of importance given to the Khulafa, there has to be importance given to those who support the Khulafa. anyone who uprises or anyone who has any negative things to say against the Khulafa, automatically they are not part of the religion of Islam, right? So they were brainwashing the community from this perspective, and it worked. My God, it worked. You look at, for example, Karbala. Karbala is adamant, it testifies to this. That when the people of Syria came towards Imam Hussein alayhi salam and said to Imam Hussein, when Imam Hussein alayhi salam questioned them and said, why are you doing what you're doing? Their reply was simple. They said, because we are supporting our leader, we're supporting Yazid and Muawiyah because he is the epitome of truth, right? Politics is religion, and religion is politics. The Caliph is a religious uh, leader. And so, from that perspective, many poets or many lines of poems were written. Storytelling was based on this. People were entertained by the Umayyads being seen in high regards, and the Ahl al-Bayt seen in, um, well, technically they were cursed. And by doing so, the Banu Umayyah were able to protect themselves. And they were now considered to be the official representative of religion. And the examples of this are so many, so many. So when you look at, for example, Ibn Ziyad, when Ibn Ziyad and this whole history of when he comes into Kufa, when Muslim Aqil is sent to Kufa and he's sent to rally the people against Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Ibn Ziyad enters the streets of Kufa and he reminds the people. And the statements that he makes is very, very clear. He says, obey the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and obey the command of the Khulafa, meaning that they both go hand in hand. Right? The Khulafa are the representatives of Allah. Likewise, when Muslim Aqil, in his final moments, he asks for, part of his masayib is that he asks for water to drink. And they bring him water, but then there is a person there who says to him, he says, well, hold on a second. By God, you'll never taste this water. In fact, you will not taste the coolness of this water until you taste the boiling waters of hell. And so Muslim Aqil, he turns to this person and he says, who are you? Why do you say such things? And the man replies, he says, because you walked into the streets of Kufa, you rallied the people against, the Caliph. To go against the Caliph was a crime. It was a crime in itself, because to go against the Caliph was as effective as going against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, we see this again in Karbala as well, when the commanders of the Umayyad armies, they would come towards the Kufans and they would remind the Kufans and they would say to them, look, this is Husayn ibn Ali you're dealing with. This is a person who has gone against your Caliph, right? So there's so much evidences to support the idea that people believed in going against the Caliph was going against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of the propaganda that was taught to them. And when Imam Hussein alayhi salam gave his life on the 10th of Muharram, effectively he was able to create a shift. He was able to create a separation between the two. That no, there is a difference between a political leader and a religious leader. As long as that leader is not an imam from the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam, there is a vast difference between the two. Meaning that if a person is a political leader, he may not necessarily be a religious leader at the same time.
Thank you for that, Sheikh. Swiftly moving on, I think from those of us that have seen the Mukhtar narrative, a series on Hazrat Mukhtar, I think may be well versed with some of the uprisings that took place after the events of Karbala, such as the Tawabi movement and that of Mukhtar himself. But I guess the question is, were there any events or any uprisings or any revolutions before the revolution of Imam Hussein alayhi salam against the Umayyads?
Yeah. So there were many uprisings against the Umayyad before even Imam Hussein alayhi salam led his uprising on the 10th of Muharram. What's interesting is that all of them were from the Khawarij, right? Each and every one of them were from the Khawarij. Now the Khawarij, going back in history, they were those who threatened the Muslim Ummah at the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam. And Imam Ali alayhi salam saw it necessary to fight against them for the sake of not causing fitna and fasad, dissension within the community. But what's interesting is that the Khawarij, they had hatred against the Imam alayhi salam, but they also had hatred against the Banu Umayyah. And this put them in a position where they were not happy with the Khulafa, they were not happy with the regime of the Banu Umayyah, but they did not show support towards the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam. And what's even more interesting is that Imam Ali alayhi salam on his deathbed, in one of the statements he makes a statement with regards to the Khawarij. He says to his confidants, he says, do not engage in a battle with them, do not fight them, because their enemies and our enemies are the same, right? Referring to the Banu Umayyah, meaning that you should at least try and work with them at whatever capacity to try and fight a greater threat, which is the Banu Umayyah. But obviously, history doesn't go that way. What happens is that the Banu Umayyah, obviously, they see this as a threat. They somehow join with the Khawarij against the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam. But more importantly, what happened was because of the hatred of the Khawarij towards the Banu Umayyah, there were many uprisings and many revolts that they would engage in. History testifies that the Khawarij were people who did not, they were not disciplined people. They did not have principles. They could not distinguish between an officer, a soldier of the Banu Umayyah, and a civilian, and so they would kill. They would cause bloodshed wherever they were, men, children, women. It didn't matter to them. That's how brutal they were. So when you ask the question, were there revolutions before Karbala? They were in the hands of the Khawarij, but it didn't go as far. And the reason for that is interesting, is because they would go into cities, they would kill, they would move on, but then it wouldn't really attract the attention of the Banu Umayyah in general. They didn't see the Khawarij as a threat per se. Whenever they would engage in a revolt, it would often be ignored. It would often just die down. And we see this in the world today, right? We see many revolutions taking place, and they're given, 15 minutes of attention. It's alive in the news for a few days, and then it just dies down. It doesn't really uphold for much longer than that. And this was the issue with the Khawarij. They would go, they would revolt, but then the effects of that would not hold for very long, and people would just forget and move on. People didn't even look towards the Khawarij, not even give them a sense of importance. So yeah, there were many revolutions, but they didn't catch on very quickly.
Okay, and just on the same topic on the revolutions that the Khawarij did, are you potentially able to give a few examples where we can see the reason between the two revolutions that took place? More so the uprising of the Khawarij and the uprising of Imam Husayn alayhi salam. And of course, history states that Imam Husayn alayhi salam had no more than 7,200 or so companions and soldiers, and assuming the Khawarij had a lot more numbers than Imam Husayn alayhi salam did. So what's the difference in Imam Husayn alayhi salam's revolution, which is of course still alive till now, and we can see the ripple effects? But what happened with the movements of the Khawarij that it died down so abruptly, like you said?
So that's a very interesting point you made, because on the 10th of Muharram, Imam Hussein only had 72 members, only had 72 followers, and those 72 followers, you don't really consider that as a battle, as a worthy battle to even mention in the books of history, right? 72 against what, 30,000 against the opposition. Yet 1400 years later, we remember Imam Hussein and his struggles and his endeavors like it happened yesterday. There's a very interesting hadith that's mentioned under the authority of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, salawatullah wa salamu alayhi. A man came to him and he said to him, Yabna Rasulillah, I have a very sensitive question to ask. He said, what is it? He said, why is it that we remember the 10th of Muharram? Why is it that we remember Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, but we don't remember his father, his grandfather, Rasulullah? So we remember Imam Hussein, we cry, we lament, we perform matam, we perform eulogies, we recite poems, but we don't remember the wafat of Rasulullah in the same way, or the shahada of Rasulullah in the same way. And then he asks, or he goes on even more. He says, why is it that we remember Abi Abdullah in one way, but we don't remember his father, Imam Ali alayhi salam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, in the same way? It says, why do we remember Imam Hussein, but we don't remember his mother Fatima al-Zahra in the same way? Why is it that we remember Imam Hussein, but we don't remember Imam Hassan in the same way? Right? It's a very interesting question, isn't it? Because
Hmm.
it's a fundamental question that we need to ask ourselves. Why is it that we remember Imam Hussein, but we don't remember the other Imams in the same way? And if I'm not mistaken, there's a hadith on this area as well, where the Imam explains, he says that when you read our Masa'ib, don't read just our Masa'ib. Make sure that you go towards the Masa'ib of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So when you cry for us, don't cry for us only. Make sure that you cry for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So that's why, many speakers, many scholars, many ulama, whenever they begin the Masa'ib, the Ghambayat, they always mention a few lines of Masa'ib of that personality whose night we're commemorating, and then they move to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Because this is the practice of the ulama, right? Um, so the Imam alayhi salam, Imam Sadiq replies, he says, when or the day when the Holy Prophet passed away, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Fatima al-Zahra, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, they were there and they commemorated the death of Rasulullah. When Fatima al-Zahra passed away, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein were there and they commemorated her passing the way it ought to be commemorated. When Amir al-Mu'mineen passed away, Imam Hassan was there and Imam Hussein were there. And they remembered their father, they commemorated their father, they lamented their father the way he ought to be lamented. When Imam Hassan passed away, Imam Hussein was there and he lamented for his brother. It says, but when Imam Hussein alayhi salam passed away, there was no one there to lament and to cry and to weep over him the way he ought to be lamented over. Very interesting words that the Imam alayhi salam mentions. And then the narrator, he asks a follow-up question. He says, yeah, but Imam Sajjad was there. The fourth Imam was there. Upon which Imam Sadiq replies, he says, yes, Sahih, my grandfather was there, Imam Sajjad was there, but he wasn't from Ahl al-Kisa. Right? So it shows you the fada'il of Ahl al-Kisa above all of the other A'imma alayhi salam. Right? It shows you the position of the five compared to those who are outside of this five. That their position is unique, that their position is something that cannot be touched. And so Imam Hussein has that, it has that, a level of spirituality, and it all comes down to, the creation, the Anwar of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, the light of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. It's not, we're not just looking at personalities, we're not just looking at physical beings, we're looking at spiritual beings. You refer back to the hadith of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. The whole creation was created because of their nur. Because of their existence, everything else came into existence. So they have a very unique position alongside the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When they were killed, it had a ripple effect. It had a major, major ripple effect within time itself. And it was as if their revolution was wholeheartedly immortalized.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. And of course, the troubles and the sermons and the activities that were undertaken by Imam Sajjad and Lady Zainab throughout propagating the mission of Imam Hussein alayhi salam for every street and corner that Yazid provided them as a platform. Of course, also undoubtedly paved the way of the message of Imam Hussein to kind of go into every nook and corner, as opposed to the messages and the uprising of arguably the Khawarij. So, Sheikh, it seems that there is indeed many questions that can come from tonight's topic titled "Effects and Consequences of Karbala," more so on the movements that happened in various cities such as Hijaz, Kufa, and of course the capital of the time, Damascus and Syria. But at this time, I think it might be a good time to end it here and potentially carry on from next week. Sheikh, is there any other concluding remarks that you would like to leave us with?
So yeah, inshallah, we'll continue the exposition of this particular topic, the aftermath and the consequences of Karbala. It's a very interesting subject. It's not something that's elaborated much more on by the ulama, but inshallah we'll try and collate as much information as possible, and we'll hope to see you next week, inshallah, Muhammad.
Inshallah. Well, just as a quick summary for the viewers, today's discussion was titled "The Effects and Consequences of Karbala" within the series, an exposition of Ashura, where we introduced this topic and spoke about revolutions that took place before Karbala that have also been quoted in the Quran, but more so of the Khawarij, and which inevitably led to the downfall of the Umayyads because of the uprising of Imam Husayn alayhi salam. Sheikh, thank you so much for your time today. We look forward to next week's discussion, continuing the series of the exposition of Ashura. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us all the opportunity to learn from this beautiful religion and to enhance in our opportunity so that we are able to continue serving this religion. We also pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the reappearance of the 12th Hujjah, Imam al-Mahdi Ajralahu ta'ala Faraja, and so that when he does come, we are also part of his ashab and ansar. Jazakallah, Sheikh. Thank you so much for your time, and inshallah we will see you next week.
Inshallah next week. Take care.